Hi everyone, my name is Monica Kelly, and the behaviorist that I chose was Mark Sundberg, and I was really interested in him because I'm familiar with the VB map, so he's a cool person to learn about. So, who is Mark Sundberg? He is a BCBAD and a PhD. This means that he is a board-certified behavior analyst, and that is at the doctoral level. He is still alive. He is still practicing in the field of ABA and is researching different topics and presenting his work across the country. He does a lot of different verbal behavior workshops and things like that. He primarily works with individuals with ASD or other abilities. He has also worked with animals, but that's not as frequent for him. So for dates active, he received his doctoral degree from Western Michigan University in 1980 in the area of applied behavior analysis. Is an active member of the ABA community, and he still is to this day. He gives a lot of different presentations all over the country. If you're interested in hearing him speak, his schedule of workshops and things like that are on his website, which I found very helpful with this presentation. So for literature, he's written over 50 professional papers in 6 different book chapters, and he was the creator and author of the VB MAP, which is the Verbal Behavior Milestones Assessment and Placement Program. I use this in my classroom with almost all of my students. It's super beneficial for me as their teacher, and it helps me guide their instruction, create IEP goals, things like that. That are very targeted skills in regards to communication and verbal behavior. So the articles that I reviewed written by Mark Sundberg, there was 50 of them, so it's kind of hard for me to narrow down and pick which ones I wanted to look at. The first one was that I reviewed were 30 points about motivation from Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, and that was from the analysis of verbal behavior. The second one that I chose to review, and the intraverbal relation, I found that one super interesting. And the next one I reviewed was intraverbal behavior and verbal conditional discriminations in typically developing children and children with autism. The fourth one that I reviewed was the benefits of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior for children with autism. And the final 5th article that I chose was covert verbal mediation and arbitrary matching to sample. So all of these pretty much focus on verbal behavior and communication and language. A lot of them also have to do with motivation. So there is definitely a pattern with that. Pretty blatantly obvious that his main focus of work is that verbal behavior area. Some of these 50 are reviews of other studies. Some are his original work. So one example of him analyzing another study or another behaviorist was when he looked at and reviewed Skinner's book, Verbal Explains that Verbal Behavior Approach, as a relation to behavior, motivation, discrimination variables, and consequences. So he goes on to explain that there are 7 different verbal operants, which Skinner identified in his book. We all know those are echoic, mand, tact, intraverbal, textual, transcriptive, and copying a text. He noted that these can be super useful and helpful as a foundation for assessing and providing adequate interventions for different programs. And it can be super helpful for children with ASD and other developmental disabilities because, as we know, there are often communication deficits with those disabilities. He used some of those in the VB map, which was kind of a cool crossover to see. Another article that I reviewed examined the verbal stimulus control and the interverbal relation. So again, that verbal behavior is a top focus for him. He points out that the intraverbal relation is often missing from different language theories, and he really emphasized the importance of it in this article. It's really overlooked, so he wanted to drive that home. And it reviewed the 4 different types of complex verbal discriminations, which are relevant to both the speaker and the listener. And those 4 types are simple and compound, verbal condition, and verbal function altering. So it kind of goes through those 4 things and describes how it can alter the effects for the listener and the speaker. The study of linguistics was explained that it's often centered around spoken words, which kind of makes sense. But because of this, intraverbal and manned operants are often missed as separate relations. So I thought that was like super cool to look at it that way. Typical way of looking at linguistics. So for the next step of this project, we have to come up with mock interview questions. I thought it would be super cool and super interesting if I actually could interview him to learn more about his life and contributions. There's so much that he's contributed to verbal behavior. I find it super fascinating. It's a big part of my day as a teacher in an autism classroom is teaching communication and the different verbal operants. It's built into my student schedules. So he has really impacted me in my classroom a lot. So one of the questions that I thought I would ask him would be, how and why did you choose verbal behavior to be the focus of your work? I just kind of to see if he thought it was interesting or where it kind of came about. The second question I would have asked him would be, what piece of advice would you give a BCBA trainee about this field? As we all know, we're going through this process. It's pretty lengthy. If there's any little pieces of advice that may be helpful for us, would be super good to know. The third question I would ask in this interview would be, did you complete any research that didn't turn out how you planned, and what did you do next? I feel like in the scientific field, in the scientific community, that probably happens a lot, but we don't really hear about it necessarily. You hear about the successes, and I was kind of wondering if maybe it deterred him or gave him new ideas that he wanted to look at even more. The fourth question that I would ask him would be, what part of the verbal behavior approach do you think is most crucial for children to learn? I think it's all super important, but I didn't know if maybe he kind of liked to focus on one area first or something like that. And the fifth question I would like to ask him would be, do you plan to continue researching and providing literature on the topic of verbal behavior? And do you have any upcoming work that you're looking forward to sharing? There have been, basically upon his graduation and even a little bit before, his 50 articles, but nothing super recently. So I'm kind of interested to hear and see if anything else is coming in the near future. Major contributions to the field of applied behavior analysis definitely includes the area of verbal behavior. When I think verbal behavior, I kind of think Mark Sundberg. He wrote and authored the VB Map, which is that verbal behavior milestones assessment and placement program. And for those of you who don't know, the VB Map it breaks down language and related skills into 6. Those are also called domains. And the VB Map can also help identify a student's strengths and weaknesses across a variety of critical skills. And then those skills make it are compared with typically developing children. And the way the VB Map is set up, there's like a scoring guide, and it makes it super easy to compare the child in their language to that of a typically developing student. I think it's extremely helpful. He's changed the lives of many practitioners and children with this assessment program, and I think it will continue. Additionally, he also was a founder and former editor of the Journal of the Applied Behavior Analysis of Verbal Behavior. So back to that key point that he focuses on is that verbal behavior. So that was another major contribution that he had in this field. Here are my citations. A lot of my biography information and photos that I use were from his website. And then I also listed the articles that I reviewed for this project. Thanks for listening, and I hope you learned a little bit more about Mark Sundberg.